the summer of 1973, 19-year-olds Janice Pietrippola and Lynn Seathaler enjoyed a vacation of sun, surf, and relaxation in Virginia Beach. They rented a small beach cottage close to the water, marking their first vacation planned on their own after saving up for a year. Janice was known for being quiet and shy, while Lynn was more outgoing. They had been best friends throughout high school and had graduated the previous year. Following graduation, Janice entered the workforce as an editorial assistant, and Lynn became a secretary. On June 29th, the women were enjoying their last day of the holiday. They had spent the day souvenir shopping, tanning on the beach, and drinking wine. Sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., the hotel manager saw the women walk by his office window. They were alone and nothing seemed amiss. Virginia Beach was considered one of the safest cities in the United States. It had a low crime rate, but the remainder of the decade wouldn't be kind to the area. Over 10 unsolved murders would plague the region, which turned its once nostalgic charm into something more sinister. The following morning, a motel employee was becoming annoyed that the occupants of Cabin 4 hadn't checked out yet. He was trying to organize his day and he needed to get the room cleaned before the next guests arrived, or was the body of Lynn Seathaler. The foot he had seen next to the bed belonged to Jan Pietrippola. The employee immediately knew the women had passed. He could still vividly recall the stillness and silence that lay over the room like a thick blanket. He called the police, who quickly arrived on scene. It was discovered that Janice had been strangled, raped, and shot 3 times. Lynn was shot twice, although she had also been strangled and her neck cut with a broken wine bottle. The excessive overkill of the 2 women painted a violent scene. The investigation concluded that the killer had entered by removing a window screen, and either entered earlier in the evening and lied in wait, or entered while they were sleeping. The killer had also dumped the contents of the women's purse. However, it didn't appear that anything of value was taken, so robbery didn't seem to be the attacker's motive. Police executed a massive undertaking to find a suspect. The once sleepy surf town was turned upside down and included helicopter searches, the scouring of rooftops, and even climbing down manholes. The girls had no enemies, there were no witnesses, and despite the Virginia Police Department's best efforts, the case went cold. At the time, police had no idea if it had been a target attack, random, or simply a crime of opportunity. Although this was the first major homicide case in the area, it wouldn't be the last. In the years following Janice and Lynn's murders, 10 more women either disappeared from the area or were murdered between 1974 and 1980. The women were all young, attractive, and the manner of their death seemed consistent. They all included sexual assaults, strangulation, and extreme violence. Some women were murdered in their homes, others found in their cars, or dumped on the pristine beaches. Although the cases have yet to be formally linked, a Virginia Beach Police Department spokesperson confirmed that the cases were similar and a serial killer connection had been looked into. They stated that they were in the process of connecting the dots. DNA evidence is likely what the police will use to connect those dots. In 2018, it was announced that there was a strong lead in the 1973 murders of Janice and Lynn, and in 2019 they made an arrest, 43 years after their murders. 82-year-old Ernest Broadnax was arrested in New York. Broadnax has a lengthy criminal history. In the 1980s, he had 2 convictions for sexual assault. He had 11 convictions in total, including assault, burglary, weapons offenses, and trespassing. Many of these cases were connected to sexual assaults, but he made deals with prosecutors to plead guilty to lesser charges if the assault charges were dropped. His MO was entering a woman's home through a window and assaulting a woman at gunpoint. In 2012, New York passed legislation requiring anyone with a felony be required to submit DNA to the state. It was this law that led to the capture of Broadnax, as he hadn't been a suspect, but a random hit with the national database linked him to the Slanes. Broadnax is also being investigated for connections to several other murders in the area following Janice and Lynn's murder. Beverly Christensen, murdered in 1974, Maria Estelle Remick, murdered in 1976, Barbara Jean Monaco, missing since 1978, Brenda Bancroft, murdered in 1979, Alice Eskew, murdered in 1979, Joan Zwingman and Christine Pilzak, murdered in 1983. In 1973, it seems as though Broadnax had been released following a 10-year sentence for murder and several robberies in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Broadnax was jailed from 1985 to 1989, a period when the murders stopped. Following that, Broadnax relocated to New York City, where his criminal behavior followed him, but the crimes in Virginia Beach waned. It is unlikely that Broadnax will face justice. He has been diagnosed with dementia and has been declared unfit to stand trial. Prosecutors are reviewing all available options to achieve justice, but it likely won't be seen in the form of a criminal trial. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. It was May 26, 1989 when Joan Rogers had decided to take her two daughters on a little vacation. Joan was 36, Michelle, 17, and Christy, 14, left their dairy farm in Wilshire, Ohio in favor of the sun and warmth of Florida. This was the first time Joan had made such a long drive, leaving her familiar home state in the rearview mirror. The women took their time stopping at several tourist destinations, such as Jacksonville Zoo, the Kennedy Space Center, and of course, Disney World. They had meant to begin the drive back home on June 1st, but Jonah got lost and decided to tack on an extra day to the vacation, instead trying to make the drive at night. They stopped at a motel in Tampa, Florida, checking in at 12:30 p.m. They settled into the hotel room and they were seen at the hotel restaurant at 7:30 p.m. After dinner, the women loaded into the family vehicle and left the hotel property. This was the last time the women were seen. When the women failed to return home that weekend, Hal Rogers, Joan's husband, and the girl's author reported the missing. The subsequent investigation revealed the reason for the impromptu trip. It had become known in the community that Michelle had been the victim of abuse in the hands of her uncle. The charges had recently been dropped due to Michelle's reluctance to testify, and the trip was meant to get away from the gossip. On June 8th, the hotel staff had alerted management that the Rogers family room had been untouched since the day they had checked in, and their beds hadn't been slept in. Management called police and fingerprints in the room were taken. It was then that police made the Grizzly connection between the Rogers disappearance and Hal Rogers' missing person report. Only 4 days prior, they had retrieved the bodies of 3 young women from the St. Petersburg pier. The warm Florida waters had accelerated decomposition, so it had been hard to identify the women. All 3 were naked from the waist down and had been raped. They had their hands tied behind their backs, and they had ropes tied around their necks with cinder blocks weighing them down. The autopsies revealed they had water in their lungs, meaning they were alive when they'd been pushed into the water one by one. Michelle had been able to get one of her hands from the bindings, but wasn't able to detach herself from the bindings around her neck. Joan's car was found by the Courtney Campbell Causeway untouched and gave little clues as to what happened to the 3. The biggest clue police had was a brochure that had handwritten directions on it in writing that was unfamiliar to Hal, as well as a set of fingerprints that didn't match any of the women. In Joan's handwriting, it also had a description of a blue and white boat. It was concluded that the 3 had died the same night they checked into the Tampa hotel. The Tampa Police Department were flooded with tips, and it took years to run down every lead. One prominent lead was a sexual assault victim that had come forward with her story. 2 weeks prior to the Rogers murders, a 24-year-old woman said that a man had offered to give her a sunset tour of the Tampa coastline. The man attacked, assaulted her, and then refused to bring her to shore. She told police she was certain he had intended to kill her on the water when she informed him that her friend was waiting for her on the docks and had instructed to report the boat if she hadn't returned. The woman never went to police after she returned to shore. She only came forward when she heard of the murders. She gave a description of her attacker and stated the man had introduced himself as Dave Prosser. She said that the man also had said he was in the aluminum siding contracting business. Police took the handwriting sample and the description of the boat and posted it on billboards in the area in July of 1992, hoping someone might recognize the handwriting, and it actually didn't take long for a woman to call with a work order. Their neighbor, had written saying the two matched. This led investigators to Oba Chandler, a 45-year-old man who was a local to the Tampa area. Once identified as a suspect, it didn't take long for investigators to assemble a damning case. Chandler's fingerprints had been on the brochure, as well as a full palm print on the hood of the Rogers car. Chandler had ties to Ohio and had likely used that to leverage trust with Joan. Police were able to determine that shortly after the police sketch from the rape victim began circulating, Chandler abruptly moved from Tampa. He also sold his blue and white boat, and when police interviewed the buyer of the boat, he stated that he remembered seeing a stack of cinder blocks at Chandler's home. At the time of the Rogers murders, he had also worked as an aluminum building contractor. Chandler had also told his daughter he couldn't go back to Florida because he was wanted for murdering 3 women, and his son-in-law also stated that Chandler boasted about raping and killing women. On September 24, 1992, Chandler was arrested. He was charged with rape and the murder of the 3 Rogers women, as well as the rape of the surviving victim. Despite the advice of his attorneys, Chandler opted to defend himself in trial. Chandler hadn't been a stranger to the inside of a courtroom. He had previously been convicted of theft, loitering, prowling, burglary, kidnapping, and armed robbery. We saw almost this exact same crime progression with the Golden State Killer. In his testimony, he said that he'd met the Rogers women and had offered them directions, but didn't see them after. His defense was that he was stuck on the water all night with a gas leak. He claimed that he had fixed it with duct tape and in the early morning hours was able to get back to shore unassisted. A boat mechanic expert who testified on behalf of the prosecution argued that Chandler wouldn't have been able to fix such a leak with duct tape as the gasoline would dissolve the adhesive in the tape. They had also cited that the engine showed no signs of wear, damage, or repair. The evidence was damning, but ultimately, Chandler was found guilty and sentenced to death on November 4, 1994, and he was executed on November 15, 2011. Profiles were certain that Chandler had other murder victims, and it would take someone with great confidence to abduct and murder 3 women, confidence that could only come with practice. In 2014, they got that confirmed when DNA evidence connected him to the 1990 murder of Evelise Barrios Berjoisi. With a 4th murder, this now confirmed that Oba Chandler was a serial killer. Cold case investigators are now looking into other murders that occurred in the area Chandler resided in. One of Chandler's daughters said that her father was a monster and got what he deserved. In his 17 years on death row, he never had a single visitor. He was described as the loneliest man on death row. October 30th, 1998 would be a day that changed Josiah Sutton's life forever. He and 3 friends were walking down the street in Houston, Texas. The 16-year-old was an accomplished football player and had dreams of going professional. The group were approached by police officers who asked 2 of the teens to come with them. The boys were brought to the police station parking lot, unaware that a woman parked on the other side of the parking lot was identifying them based on the hats that they were wearing and the color of their skin. Her certainty was powerful, and there was little doubt in her mind that these were the boys who had attacked her. 3 days previous, the woman had been attacked by 2 men. Her initial description of the men were 2 young African-American men that were both about 5 foot 11 inches tall, slim, and 130 pounds. Josiah was over 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. He and his friend, Gregory Adams, were both arrested and charged with aggravated sexual assault. They both willingly submitted DNA samples as they had nothing to hide. They maintained their innocence, and they both had alibis. The DNA of the 2 boys was compared to DNA collected from the crime scene, and Adams was eliminated based on his DNA not matching. This should have been a red flag for investigators as the victim had been so positive Adams had been one of her attackers. His elimination should have also called into question her identification of Josiah. Josiah was certain his DNA would also eliminate him, but unfortunately for him, the lab was using an older form of DNA testing, which is no longer used, and his DNA came back as a positive match. While being held, Josiah turned 17, and from there, he was certified to stand trial as an adult. On April 23, 1999, Josiah's attorney was able to get the remaining samples sent to an independent lab. His family paid for the lab work to be done, but Josiah's attorney never finished the paperwork. The results for the independent lab were never able to be used in his trial. The lab the prosecutors used had concluded that Josiah's DNA was an exact match to the sample collected from the victim. During the trial, the crime lab employee stated that there was a 1694,000 chance it could belong to someone else. Josiah was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. In the years following his incarceration, Josiah dedicated his time to learning everything he could about DNA. In his first appeal, he fought to have an independent lab test the samples again. Throughout his investigation and incarceration, he always maintained his innocence. In 2002, he got new legal representation, and in that same year, the lab that had done his original DNA testing was being investigated. 2 reporters had received anonymous complaints that there were problems with the results that the lab was prosecutors' needs. In Josiah's case, it was determined the DNA collected from the crime scene was completely different than his. On March 11, 2003, a judge ordered the immediate release of Josiah. In 2004, he was granted a pardon of innocence. Even with being exonerated, his legal team needed to fight to have the conviction removed, as well as receiving compensation for the 4 years he was incarcerated and the costs of defending himself. The lab was forced to close down. Further reviews led to the release of 2 other men, both convicted on faulty DNA evidence: George Rodriguez and Ronald Taylor. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. It was 2007 in Heilbronn, Germany, when 22-year-old policewoman Michaelette Kaiswader was murdered. She had been in her patrol car with her partner on their lunch break when a vehicle drove by and opened fire. Michaelette was killed instantly and her partner was injured. The subsequent investigation unearthed more than a murder investigation. For decades, Germany, Austria, and France had been searching for a female serial killer with links in a variety of different cold cases, ranging from murder, break-and-enters, car thefts, and petty crimes. The only common link between the crimes was DNA. Investigators could make no sense of it. She seemed to be an expert in eluding authorities. She had managed to never be caught on surveillance or seen by witnesses. Given the vast geographical area, a lack of pattern to both her crimes and accomplices, police were always a step behind. Other accomplices convicted in connection in her crimes also denied her existence, making her that much more infamous, a seeming criminal mastermind with loyal accomplices. Initially, she was dubbed the woman without a face, but when her DNA linked her to Michelle Kiswader, she was renamed the Phantom of Heilbronn. The Phantom became a hot topic for the media. German police were also a lot of time and money trying to track the notorious murderer. There was a €400,000 reward for any information. The murder in Heilbronn was so significant because it had brought so much media attention to the Phantom in 2009. While investigating a cold case involving a burned corpse, a discovery was made. Evidence taken from the male victim, a fingerprint, contained female DNA. When run from the database, it connected to the Phantom. Investigators ran the sample again, this time with a different type of medium, which was a different brand of cotton swab, and the samples contained no female DNA, just that of the victim. Investigators then called into question all evidence that contained DNA from the Phantom. A closer look at the samples revealed that they all used the same brand of cotton swab. They went to the manufacturer of the swabs and discovered the Phantom was actually a woman who worked at the factory. The discovery became the biggest embarrassment in German criminal investigation history. The manufacturer put out a statement saying that their company's cotton swabs, while they were sterile, it was not certified to be used for DNA analysis because their sterilization process couldn't remove trace DNA. This wasn't the only country to suffer such an embarrassment. After the German blunder, Austria also discovered they had been chasing an innocent factory worker that produced materials they were using in their criminal investigation. It did bring some positives, though. There are now standards in place to ensure a certification process for raw materials used in criminal investigation. It also highlighted to police how easily a crime scene can be contaminated, noting that the smallest trace evidence can change the entire course of an investigation. It was November 6, 2001 in Las Vegas, Nevada, when a woman was getting her 2 young children ready for dinner. Her husband was at work, and when she heard movement in the other room, she had assumed it was her husband coming home. She called out, but who emerged was not her husband, but a young man she didn't know. The man demanded all of her cash, but the woman only had $23. He then decided to threaten the woman to get in her car, drive them to the nearest ATM, and withdraw as much as she could from her account. She did as instructed, and while at the ATM machine, the woman's husband spotted her and ran at the pair. The robber then fled and the police were called. In her statement, the woman described her attacker as African American, and she knew by his voice that he was likely a teenager who had been wearing a blue hoodie and a ski mask. Police began canvassing the area, and while outside the victim's home, they saw two teen boys riding their bikes. Police followed them and saw them go inside a home nearby. Police began looking around the exterior of the house in the garbage cans in the bushes and found a blue hoodie and a ski mask in the back seat of a vehicle in their driveway. Police then arrested two young men, 18-year-old Dwayne Jackson and his 15-year-old cousin, Howard Dupree Grissom. Both denied involvement in the robbery, but both submitted their DNA to being compared to the ski mask. Jackson was later charged with robbery and kidnapping when the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department concluded that their DNA was a match. Jackson maintained his innocence, and despite neither the victim or the husband could identify Jackson as her attacker, the courts proceeded with no other evidence gathering. Grissom, however, was released with no charges laid, while Jackson was presented with life in prison for the kidnapping charge alone. Jackson, scared and faced with spending decades in prison for a crime he didn't commit, accepted a plea deal offer. Prosecutors agreed to drop the kidnapping charge if he pleaded guilty to the robbery charge. Accepting this plea would waive his right to a trial. Jackson was sentenced to 4 years in prison for robbery and served 3 years before being released. Meanwhile, Jackson's cousin, Howard Dupree Grissom, was arrested in 2008 for robbery and conspiracy to commit a violent crime in Nevada. As was required for violent charges, Grissom was required to submit his DNA, and although the LVMPD should have submitted that sample to the national database, CODIS, it doesn't appear that this was done in this case. He was convicted and pleaded guilty on the robbery charges and was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison. He served 2 years before being released in 2010, and following his parole, he relocated to California. Less than 3 months after his parole, he was implicated in another crime. A woman in Moreno Valley was abducted, sexually assaulted, and based on her statement, police went to neighboring apartment and arrested Grissom. He was then charged with attempted manslaughter and faced 41 years if convicted. This time, no plea bargain was offered and Grissom went to trial. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Once he was put into the California prison system, he was once again required to submit DNA, and this time it was submitted to CODIS. It was at this point when Grissom's DNA came back in connection to a case in 2001, one where Grissom's cousin, Dwayne Jackson, had served time for a crime Grissom had actually committed, according to the DNA. California opened up an investigation, and it was discovered that when the two men had given DNA samples, those samples had been swapped. Because Jackson accepted a plea deal, the DNA was never tested again, and because Nevada didn't submit their DNA to CODIS at the time, the mistake was never caught. The error was caught in 2010, and it took another year before Jackson's lawyers were notified of the error. In July of 2011, Dwayne Jackson was exonerated and his court records were sealed. The LVMPD agreed to a $1,500,000 settlement to compensate Jackson. After the settlement, the LVMPD also changed its standards for DNA submission, and all profiles are now submitted to CODIS. The city also initiated 2 independent DNA testing firms to conduct a review of convictions that had been prosecuted based on DNA. Anna Kemp announces her pregnancy with joy, sharing that she is expecting a baby boy who will be a brother to her first child, a little girl named Gracie. She expresses her long-held desire for more than one child, hoping Gracie won't grow up alone. In March 2004, Anna, her husband John Sharp, and baby Gracie moved to their new home at 116 Prince Street, Mornington. Little did they know, this house would soon become the focal point of one of Australia's most shocking crimes. Anna took Gracie to the childcare center and returned to collect her daughter at around midday. That morning, she had also called her mother in New Zealand, and the pair had a catch-up. That evening at 8:24 p.m., another one of her friends received a call from Anna, and they too had a normal and pleasant conversation. At around 2 p.m., Anna made a phone call to her health insurance company. She wanted to have the new baby added to the family's health cover. Her friend Samantha Jeffrey had made plans to see Anna later in the week, and they were due to meet on Friday morning. Anna had marked the appointment on her calendar. On the Thursday morning, Samantha received a phone call. It was Anna's husband, John. This was highly unusual. John never called Samantha. He told Samantha that Anna had left. Dawn Hendry, Anna's best friend, also received a call from John, and she too found it strange that John was calling her, as this was completely out of character. John told Dawn that Anna had not only left with another man, but that she had also left Gracie behind. Alarm bells started to ring for Dawn. There was no way a mother as devoted as Anna would have upped and left without taking Gracie with her. On Wednesday, a TV antenna technician arrived on Prince Street to do an adjustment that Anna had booked him for. John was reluctant to let him into the house for the appointment, but the technician thought he saw somebody else, an older man inside the property, standing around 10 feet behind John. But he said he didn't have any contact with that person. The inquiries that would follow could find no trace of this older man in the Sharp home. Back in her native New Zealand, Anna's family were becoming increasingly concerned that they hadn't heard from her. They had tried calling her, but she wasn't answering, and she wasn't returning messages. Her mother, Lily, spoke with the parish priest, Father Tony Harrison. She explained to him that she had spoken to Anna on the Monday and had been trying to contact her since then, but hadn't been able to get through. While Father Harrison was visiting Lily, her phone rang. It was her son-in-law, John. He then proceeded to tell her that Anna had left him for another man. Lily could not believe it. The shocking news did not stop there, though. John told Lily that the mystery man Anna had left the marriage for was also the father of her unborn baby. After receiving permission from Lily, Father Harrison contacts Constable John Woodhouse. Initially, Constable Woodhouse was not immediately concerned. He assumed that as Anna was a Catholic, maybe she was ashamed of leaving her marriage for another man, and that she could have been worried about what her mother's reaction would have been. As the days passed and with still no sign of or word from Anna, her family becomes increasingly more worried about her. Constable Woodhouse was able to trace Anna's local health center. He was told by a nurse who had remembered Anna that she had been upset with her husband's reaction to her becoming pregnant. Those who knew and loved her could not believe that Anna, a devout Catholic, would have an affair and run away with another man. Her close friends and family all agreed that it was not something she would ever do. They were also skeptical that she had allegedly not taken Gracie with her straight away. John told Anna's family and friends that Anna had returned to collect Gracie on Sunday, March 28th, and had left the family home via a taxi. Following this, Constable Woodhouse obtained the phone numbers of every single taxi company that was operating in the Mornington area. None of the taxi companies had any record of picking up a passenger from Prince Street, where the Sharp family had lived. Constable Woodhouse had made various attempts to contact John Sharp without success. Following this, he put together a case file on Anna and had it sent over to Australia. Detective Sergeant Shane Brundle of the Victoria Police Missing Persons Unit receives the case. It was concerning to officers that a responsible woman who was a committed wife and mother, and who was expecting a second baby, would just disappear and take her child. This just wasn't in Anna's nature. The police headed down to the Mornington area. Their first task was to talk to John Sharp. They needed to know if he had any information that could help trace Gracie and Anna. They had seemingly vanished without a trace. After they had taken a detailed statement from John, the police continued to watch him closely. A few days later, he was observed walking into bushes next to a public toilet in Mornington. They watched as he picked up a blue plastic carrier bag. From it, he removed what appeared to be a credit card before returning the bag to its hiding spot. After checking the bag, police make a disturbing discovery. In it is Anna's Visa card and mobile phone. Later, the police would also find her driving license. This cemented the worst fears of everyone. Anna had most likely been met with foul play, and John Sharp was now a firm suspect. John Sharp makes a televised appeal for his wife and daughter. Detective Constable Mark Kennedy of the Missing Persons Unit was the officer who had taken John's statement when he had first been interviewed regarding the disappearance of his wife. At one stage during his statement being taken, according to Detective Constable Kennedy, John said, "I really don't care where Anna is. I just want to know where Gracie is." The way John was behaving on television was very different to the John he had met. When his first statements had been taken, he appeared very matter-of-fact and far less emotional. They knew that John Sharp had Anna's mobile phone as well as her Visa card. Her Visa card had been used to send flowers to her mother back in New Zealand. Lily did not believe that it was actually Anna who had sent the flowers. Alongside this, her mobile phone had been used since she had gone missing, and odd emails had been sent to different members of her family. In April, Gerald, Anna's brother, had received an email allegedly from his sister saying that she needed time and space. The police continued their inquiries. They returned to talk with friends and family of Anna's and interviewed John repeatedly. Whilst he is a suspect, what they cannot determine is a motive. John Sharp was interviewed again by police in Mornington, but his story hadn't changed. He was adamant that his wife had left on the March 23rd and that she had done so voluntarily. Officers were not convinced. His lack of emotion made them doubt his version of events even more. The decision was made to keep John Sharp under police surveillance. He was observed dumping potential evidence into a bin. John Sharp is arrested. During his first interview, he adamantly denied any knowledge of where Anna and Gracie were, sticking solidly to his story. But officers noted that it appeared he had wanted to tell them something but couldn't. According to John, Anna had left him for another man and had taken their daughter with her. He said that the marriage had been unhappy for some time, and Anna had eventually told him she wanted to separate as she was having a relationship with somebody else whom she had become pregnant by. This would all change in his second interview, having spoken to his family. In the afternoon, he finally confessed. When the truth was revealed about what had happened in the house on Prince Street, it was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. But who was John Sharp? What had led to this? And where were Anna and Gracie? John Sharp was born on February 28, 1967. He grew up in Mornington, Victoria, Australia, and was part of a big family. He had 4 older sisters and 1 younger brother. His parents worked as shopkeepers in Mornington. There was no history of criminal or antisocial behavior. He would later explain to a forensic clinical psychologist, Dr. Ian Joplin, that his childhood and early adult life were marked by social problems. He was unhappy at school and didn't have many friends. He completed year 12 of his schooling, but he failed his exams. And after this, he headed into the world of work. Whilst working at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, he met New Zealand-born Anna Kemp after a whirlwind romance. 27-year-old John and 31-year-old Anna would marry in October of 1994 and live together in Mornington. After leaving the world of finance, John became self-employed as a conveyancer. He was quiet, reserved, and it took a lot for him to open up with people. But the pair were content. And for Anna, as a devout Catholic, marriage and family was extremely important to her. She described John to her friends as good husband material. August 2002. John and Anna welcomed their first child into the world, a baby girl whom they would name Gracie Louise. Despite their joy, Gracie's health problems quickly became apparent. Gracie was born with a congenital abnormality called hip dysplasia. Babies born with hip dysplasia may require a corrective harness, and this is exactly what happened with baby Gracie, and she would wear one for the March 1st months of her life. Being in the harness was not easy for Gracie, and she would often become distressed and have trouble sleeping. This appeared to put a strain on Anna and John's marriage. Unfortunately, even after the corrective harness was no longer required, little Gracie still struggled with both sleeping and eating. And this was something that her mother sought the assistance of professionals for. Despite Gracie's health problems, Anna nursed her daughter through it, highlighting how devoted and dedicated she was. In spite of their struggles, according to Dawn Hendry, Anna's best friend, it appeared that they were very happy and that they enjoyed their lives together. Anna's friend Samantha Jeffries said, Gracie was everything to her. She was 100% there for Gracie. According to the New Zealand Herald, Gracie was a quiet toddler who loved lollies, painting, playing with toys, and visits to the park. In November 2002, Anna attended the Hillview Maternity Unit of Peninsula Health. She explained that she was feeling incredibly anxious and felt unable to cope. Following this, she had 3 inpatient admissions for respite with her daughter. This was to try and stabilize eating patterns and develop a regular sleeping routine. In 2003, John Sharp visited a local shop called Sport Philip Marine and purchased a spear gun and an additional spear. The purchase was made in cash, meaning that the transaction could not be traced. The date of the purchase is not known. But what is clear is that he had it in his possession prior to February 6, 2004, roughly 6.5 weeks before Anna and Gracie's disappearance. Despite practicing firing it in the garden to become more familiar with it, he had never previously shown an interest in spearfishing at all. Later that year, he and Anna bought a house in Mornington, 116 Prince Street. Many couples would be thrilled at the prospect of a new addition to the family. John Sharp was not. According to Dawn, Anna had told her that her husband had shouted at her after he had learned of her pregnancy. She also said that when she would visit Hannah and John, she had noticed the change in John's demeanor, and he would appear hostile towards his wife. Dawn found this especially odd as he had always appeared gentle. Seeing him shout at his wife in front of Gracie was particularly unusual. John had apparently decided that one child was enough of a burden. He did not want another one. In March 2004, John went to his doctor complaining about disrupted sleep patterns. He was prescribed 2 different types of sleeping tablets, although these had little effect. The doctor discussed with him that this may have been caused by an underlying depressive illness. On the March 21, 2004, John and Anna attended a picnic to celebrate the birthday of a nephew. Those that were there noted that they appeared fine, and there was no apparent tension between the pair. Following an argument between John and Anna, they headed to bed between 9 and 10 p.m. John couldn't recall the cause of the fight. Whilst Anna was able to quickly fall asleep, John wasn't. He instead stayed awake, mulling over their fight, brooding about the problems in their relationship that were becoming increasingly more apparent. He then left the bed and headed for the garage. After going back into the house, he went upstairs with his spear gun in his hand. He then proceeded to place the spear gun a few centimeters from Anna's temple. He pulled the trigger and fired a spear into her head. Despite being shot at close range, Anna was still alive and breathing. He proceeded to fire a second spear again into the head of his pregnant wife, killing her. He would later tell investigators that when he had purchased the spear gun, he was having thoughts of murdering his wife, and this was why he had bought it. He covered Anna's body in towels before going downstairs and falling asleep on the sofa bed. Gracie was asleep in her cot in another room while her mother was brutally murdered. The following day, he attempted and failed to remove the spears from Anna's head. He was only able to remove the shafts. The spearheads were left embedded in Anna's head. John then took Gracie to kindergarten and picked her up later. It was that day that the antenna technician came to the house for the appointment that Anna had scheduled. She was still lying dead in her bed at the time, and John lied to him to prevent him from coming inside. John then removed the body of his wife from the bedroom and took her out into the back garden. It was here that he dug a shallow grave and buried his pregnant wife. The horrifying series of events would not stop there. On Friday, he took Gracie to her childcare and explained that she wouldn't be returning, saying his wife had left him and gone off with another man. He also phoned his mother-in-law and told her that Anna had been having an affair with a man and that the marriage was effectively over. He said that whilst she would return in a few days to collect Gracie, he had no idea at all where she was. For days had now passed since John Sharp had fired a spear gun into the head of his pregnant wife. Gracie was put to bed in her cot at around 9 o'clock at night. Her father then proceeded to drink several glasses of whiskey and coke to, in his words, numb his senses. He then headed out to the garage for his spear gun. After entering his daughter's bedroom, he fired the spear gun at her. The spear penetrated the toddler's head, but she didn't die instantly. She instead screamed in agony and clung on to life. He went downstairs to retrieve 2 more spears that he had used in the murder of his wife. He proceeded to fire further shots at Gracie. He pulled one of the spears out of her head before firing it again. John Sharp shot his 20-month-old daughter 4 times with the spear gun before her tiny body succumbed to her injuries. "I haven't harmed my wife or my daughter. I haven't harmed either of them." It was later revealed that he had gone back to support Philip Mayreen and taken Gracie with him as he bought another spear, the one he would later use to brutally murder his daughter. This quiet man who appeared to be a loving husband and doting father was now the murderer. The next morning, he returned to his daughter's bedroom. He covered his eyes with a towel so he could not see what he had done to Gracie. He removed the spears from her head before wrapping her tiny body in tarpaulin and bin bags, binding it with duct tape. He then took her to the Mornington Refuse Transfer Station and disposed of her body along with the spears and spear gun. He also discarded some of Gracie's clothes and toys. On the day he had disposed of Gracie's body, he phoned Lily, Anna's mother, and told her that Gracie and Anna were together in a bigger and better place. He also used Anna's phone to make a call, as well as making several withdrawals from her bank account at a cash point in Chelsea. Up until May 15, 2004, he would make several more phone calls from Anna's phone to maintain the lie that she was still alive. Over the week that followed, he systematically disposed of more items associated with Gracie and continued to maintain his lie that Anna had left and taken Gracie with her. John Sharp used Anna's name to create a false email and used this to contact her brother Gerald in New Zealand. It set out the scenario that he had invented to explain why she had failed to contact her family or return their messages. The aim of the email was to create the impression that she had walked away from her marriage to John for another man, and that she and Gracie were happy and safe. Also that day, John Sharp visited a hardware store in Frankston. He bought an electric chainsaw, 2 tarpaulins, and a roll of duct tape. He then exhumed the body of his wife the next day and dismembered her into 3 pieces. He used the tarpaulin to wrap up her remains and disposed of them, and the chainsaw in various waste collection bins at the Mornington transfer station. Over the weeks that followed, he disposed of the mattress that was covered in Anna's blood. He also continued to send fake emails to various family members, as well as write letters to Anna's friends. It was during this time that he arranged for flowers to be sent to Anna's mother, pretending that they were from her. When police began to investigate, John told officers that Anna had moved to the suburb of Chelsea in Melbourne and had taken Gracie with her. His behavior during the appeals attracted significant attention. Some noted his apparent lack of tears and his odd demeanor. His story also appeared to be inconsistent. He talked about having spoken to his wife the week prior and pleaded with anyone with knowledge of hers and Gracie's whereabouts to come forward. But then he also maintained that she had left him for another man. One thing that also stuck out to investigators were his referrals to his wife and daughter in the past tense. On June 1st, John Sharp went back to his doctor. His doctor found Sharp to be agitated and that his concentration and memory were both poor. The doctor subsequently diagnosed him with depression, but only after he had told the doctor the lie that Anna had left him. Even the most hardened and seasoned detectives were in shock as John Sharp confessed to his crimes. The matter-of-fact, cold and chilling way he discussed what he had done was disturbing to all investigating. Following his confession, the devastating news was relayed to Anna's family back in her native New Zealand. The nature of the murders, coupled with the callous way that their bodies had been disposed of, left them broken. He said to the officers that he had killed his wife because their marriage was unhappy, and told them that Anna was controlling and moody. When talking about Gracie, he said he was thinking of taking care of Gracie by myself. And just amongst all this madness, that's when I lost the plot. Norelle Fraser worked for Victoria Police for almost 30 years. Half of that time was spent as a detective in the Missing Persons Unit and Rape and Homicide Squads. She cannot believe the level of callousness and coldness being exhibited by John Sharp. A team of investigators were behind a two-way mirror, and we watched the interview. And it was the first time we had ever heard him talk about what he had done. To listen to a man talk with no emotion whatsoever about how he had just speared his wife and little girl and cut his wife up with a chainsaw and thrown her out in the household bin, it went to another level. When asked why he had murdered his 20-month-old daughter, Gracie, John Sharp replied, "The child belongs with the mother." During their searches, sniffer dogs were used in the back garden. Officers also found in various bins around Mornington notes in John's handwriting detailing backup stories, and his cover story pertaining to his wife's disappearance. In the house, they found the receipt showing the purchase of the duct tape, chainsaw, and tarpaulins. Throughout their inquiries, blood belonging to both Anna and Gracie were also found inside the house. Police volunteered for the search today, saying they wanted to help bring closure for Anna Kemp's family in New Zealand. A huge search was soon underway to try and find the bodies of Anna and Gracie. In late June, the police began to search the transfer station for Anna and Gracie's remains and the landfill site where the waste from the transfer station would ultimately end up. The task before them was huge, but they were determined they would not stop until the bodies of Gracie and her pregnant mother were found. Officers offered to come in on days off to help with the search. There was no shortage of investigators who were willing to volunteer to help. As officers continued to hunt for them, the horrifying story's front page news. Police chaplain the Reverend James Pilmer was on hand to help officers who were working against the elements in tough conditions. His presence was welcome amongst the team, who were facing such an appalling set of circumstances that had led them to the landfill. After 3 weeks of searching through tons and tons of waste, a discovery is finally made. A blue tarpaulin is found. Inside are some of the remains of Anna Kemp. By mid-July, all of Anna's remains were finally found. Police search teams then found Gracie's body. Detective Sergeant Shane Brendel and Detective Constable Mark Kennedy carried her tiny body out of the landfill, being sure to treat her with the respect and dignity she both deserved and had been cruelly denied by her own father. They didn't leave her and stayed with her until the undertaker arrived. Whilst the investigating teams were devastated, there was a sense of relief that they had been able to find Anna and Gracie for the sake of their family, ensuring they could be properly buried, and those who knew and loved them would have a chance to say their goodbyes. A liaison officer had been appointed in New Zealand to keep Anna's family up to date and support them as they came to terms with what had happened. Constable John Woodhouse was there to accompany the Kemp family as they made their way to Mornington for a funeral service for Anna, Gracie, and Anna's unborn baby. This allowed Anna's friends and loved ones in Victoria to grieve their loss and pay their respects. People from Gracie's kindergarten also came to remember a beautiful little girl, whose all too short life had been so cruelly cut short. Constable Woodhouse called it a spiritual and healing service. After this, Anna and Gracie were flown back to New Zealand for their burial. St. Joseph's Cathedral was filled with 200 family members and friends. Father Tony Harrison conducted the funeral service. He spoke of his admiration for the Victoria Police, who had worked so tirelessly to bring them home. He said that it was a relief that Anna, Gracie, and Anna's unborn baby could be buried with dignity. Constable Woodhouse, who had initially raised the alarm with the Australian police and conducted his own investigations in a different country, was one of the pallbearers for Anna. Anna's brother Gerald spoke on behalf of their brother Joe and mother Lily, and gave his heartfelt thank yous to the friends and loved ones both in New Zealand and Australia for their constant support and love. Anna and Gracie were buried in Green Park Cemetery under Anna's maiden name of Kemp, along with Francis, the unborn son she had been expecting. While awaiting trial, Sharp was being held in the special units of Bar 1 prison. Whilst there, he required close observation and treatment due to suicidal tendencies. Dr. Ian Joplin examined him on 2 separate occasions. He considered him to be an inadequate, isolated, and withdrawn individual. He believed that Sharp lacked the psychological resources to cope with the stress that life can bring, and that he appeared to be very dependent on his parents. According to some members of the family, one motive for John Sharp murdering Anna was that she had discovered he had been abusing their daughter, but this claim has not been substantiated. In a report by the Sunday Herald Sun in 2005, the claim came when family letters alleged that John Sharp had a history of abusing children. It was alleged that he had committed crimes of a sexual nature against young members of a circle of family and friends 20 years before he had murdered his wife. One relative remarked, "We reckon she caught him. We think that's why he killed her." In a letter sent to various members of John Sharp's family, an alleged victim said, "I became his prey for 2 years, and he always kept that power. His smell still haunts me. It was reported that the alleged victim had approached some of his family 5 years before to tell them that she had been abused by him. And when Anna and Gracie disappeared, she told the police what she had told his family. The report stated that his mother and her husband were not told about this until after he had confessed to murdering Anna and Gracie. Constable Woodhouse said he did not believe the claims could have played a part in John Sharp's confession. I worked on this for nearly 2 years, and that has never been mentioned as a possibility. It was the weight of evidence which forced a confession, not anything else. It is important to reiterate that this claim of abuse against Gracie, being a motive for John murdering Anna, has not been substantiated. Before long, it was time for John Sharp to enter his plea. The 38-year-old stood in the Supreme Court of Victoria and entered a plea of guilty to the murders of Anna and Gracie. He could not be charged for the death of the baby that Anna had been carrying. Sharp wiped tears from his eyes as he looked down at the floor. He was breathing heavily and appeared to be unsteady on his feet as Judge Bernard Bongiorno read his sentencing remarks. In fact, as you later told police, from the moment you killed your wife, you began to have thoughts that you would have to kill Gracie to maintain your facade of innocence with respect to Anna's murder. Indeed, at some time between your wife's death and the time you actually killed your daughter, you took her with you to Sportfort Marine, where you purchased another spear for the spear gun. There could have been only one reason for that purchase, which was carried out in circumstances of unspeakable callousness. He also highlighted how John had made claims about Anna that she could not defend herself against during the second of his police interviews. You said that your marriage was unhappy and that your wife was controlling and moody. You claim she came between you and your family and siblings and prevented you from seeing them as often as you would have liked. Whether such claims have any truth or not now matters not at all. Anna cannot deny them. They provide neither justification nor excuse for anything that you have done. The judge told the court that the murder of Anna was singular in its barbarity. When talking about the murder of 20-month-old Gracie, the judge said, "Gracie was a defenseless child for whom you had a legal and, more importantly, a moral responsibility. And whatever your motive for killing Anna might have been, in Gracie's case it was simply so that your first crime would not be discovered." The judge called his actions egregiously wicked and said that John Sharp had been well aware of what he was doing when he committed these crimes. Watching via a video link from New Zealand, Anna's mother broke down during the sentencing. The judge referred to observations made by Dr. Lester Walton, a psychiatrist, who stated that John Sharp was a socially inept, dependent, passive, and a retiring individual who was unable or reluctant to confront problems. Dr. Walton offered the opinion that these killings were irrational, although he could find no evidence that you were suffering from any frank psychiatric illness. I presume that by irrational, he meant that you considered the killing of your wife and later your child were the only options you could see to relieve a state of desperation you considered yourself to be in. Dr. Walton recounts your speaking of feeling threatened by your daughter, a situation which is, of course, objectively absurd. The horrified courtroom sat and listened as the disturbing chain of events that had transpired were finally laid bare. John Sharp was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms with a non-parole period of 33 years for his crimes. As they left the court, John Sharp's mother cried before reading a prepared statement. John's crimes were horrific. He has given himself a life sentence for what he has done, and he will live with this for the rest of his life. The New Zealand Herald reported some of Sharp's family and friends refused to believe his story, and feigning support for him, questioned him to try and pick inconsistencies. The report also stated, the Herald's son said there was a bitter split in Sharp's family after his confession, with some relatives disgusted that he was still visited in jail by his mother and 2 sisters. Supportive family members initially urged him to explore the possibility of pleading insanity. But others said Sharp was always a dark and troubled character who was manipulative and sly. One of Sharp's nieces also issued a statement, which was, in her words, on behalf of the non-supportive family members of John Sharp. She thanked the Australian and New Zealand police forces for their tireless work in bringing John Sharp to justice. She said, "We would like to say that John's crimes have stolen 3 beautiful and precious lives. We also send our heartfelt condolences to Anna's family in New Zealand, whose pain and suffering is tremendous. The skill, commitment, and dedication of officers in both Australia and New Zealand allowed for justice to be served, and for John Sharp to be punished for his horrendous actions. Anna Kemp and her unborn son were killed by the man that she had dedicated her life to. Baby Gracie died in agony at the hands of the man who was supposed to protect her. Despite the horrendous way their lives were taken, those who knew and loved Anna and Gracie are determined that they will be remembered for the happiness that they brought to so many people, gaining comfort in the knowledge that Anna, Gracie, and Francis are resting peacefully together. On July 27, 1981, in Birmingham, UK, Nova Welsh, a 24-year-old mother of two, stopped answering her phone. Recently separated from her husband, Osmond Bell, Nova's disappearance was out of character. On the day she vanished, she had dropped her children off with her ex-husband and went out dancing with her new boyfriend, Wayne Newby, and a group of friends. A neighbor reported seeing her return that evening, visibly upset. In the days following her disappearance, neighbors mentioned hearing crying and fighting coming from Nova's apartment. This unfortunately was a regular occurrence, as her ex-husband had been known to be violent and abusive to Nova throughout their relationship. Nova's parents and siblings had just immigrated to Miami, Florida, and her mother Lorna became increasingly distressed that she couldn't get a hold of her daughter. They had hoped that Nova would bring her children and join them in the U.S. Nova and her family were very close. The family had immigrated to the UK from Jamaica in 1957 at 16. Nova got into a relationship with Osmond Bell and moved out to live with him when she became pregnant with her first child. She had recently escaped the relationship, kicking her abusive spouse out of their home, and she was rebuilding her life without him. They had only been separated for a few weeks when she disappeared. Bell was interviewed before the discovery of her body. He hadn't reported her missing, claiming to officers that he just assumed she had run away with her new boyfriend or visited her family in the US. Without evidence, police were forced to release Bell. On August 18, 1981, there was a discovery made in the building Nova lived in. Residents began reporting a terrible smell coming from somewhere in the building. Officers were dispatched, and in a utility closet, they discovered Nova's body covered in a blanket and newspapers. Bell was arrested and held for 4 days. While they did their initial investigation, her autopsy showed that her cause of death had been a broken neck. Police received a letter from a witness claiming that they had seen Welsh fighting with a man who clearly wasn't Osmond in her kitchen. Police asked if Bell knew anything about the author of the letter, to which he denied. Without any further evidence to connect Bell to the slain, they were forced to release him. After that, the case went cold in 2016. Cold case detectives were going through old cases, now that DNA evidence had advanced significantly since the 80s. The investigators were particularly hopeful in Nova Welch's case. Her file contained a piece of gum that was used to secure the cupboard door closed that she had been found in, as well as potential DNA on the letter that had been mailed to police. They found that the DNA on the letter and the DNA on the chewing gum matched. Following that, they got a court order to secure DNA from Osmond Bell, and from there they compared the DNA. He was then arrested and had a trial. A year later, the courts determined that the murder had not been premeditated and had been a result of Bell flying into a fit of rage when he discovered that Nova had been out with a new man. It was determined that he had written the letter and mailed it to police to divert attention off of him. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The now 60-year-old had been living as a free man for 34 years. Nova's mother Lorna said in her victim impact statement at the trial that Nova was gentle, loving, and full of life, and that the unfortunate and tragic loss of her life prevented her from seeing her children grow up as young adults. It was a late evening on December 14, 1995, when 17-year-old Tracy Blasinovic told her boyfriend that she would go get something to eat. The two were living out of a North Temple motel in Salt Lake City, Utah. She told him she was going to the Circle K gas station, a short walk from the motel. By around midnight, her boyfriend Chris began to worry, as it was unlike Tracy to not come home. He went out to look for her, knocking on neighbors' doors and going down to the Circle K. However, he failed to report her missing the following morning, 45 miles from Salt Lake City. At the Provo River, a man was hunting with his son when they came across a body. The woman was naked and had been brutally murdered. Several granite rocks around her body were covered in blood. The police started their investigation at the crime scene. There, they took several rocks around her body as evidence. As her cause of death was blunt force trauma, they felt it was likely that one of the stones had been the murder weapon. They also found a pair of socks neatly folded on a rock near the body, since a woman had no identification. They decided to appeal to the media and publish photos of her tattoos. She had 2 distinct tattoos, which police were hopeful someone would recognize. Meanwhile, Chris was still not able to locate Tracy. He had started combing through the news. It wasn't like Tracy to not return. He was fearful that something terrible had happened. His heart sank when a news segment began discussing a murdered Jane Doe and had displayed familiar tattoos. He contacted police to tell them that he knew who the Jane Doe was. Chris gave the police the only contact number he had for Tracy's family. Police called and made contact with Tracy's stepfather, who was devastated. They were only a few minutes into the conversation before a realization was made. The body they discovered was likely his younger stepdaughter, Crystal, not his daughter, Tracy. Crystal had a history of using her older half-sister's identity. Her stepfather told police that Crystal had dropped out of high school and was working as a prostitute. She had started getting mixed up in drugs at 15, and though her parents tried to get her help, she didn't want to make any changes to her lifestyle. Chris was brought in as a suspect. They felt that Chris had purposely lied about Crystal's identity, and they also felt it was suspicious that he hadn't reported her missing, and he also hadn't been honest about where she'd been that night. Crystal hadn't gone out for food that night. She went to work, and the police were back to square one, having no idea where to start their search. Chris was released as there was no evidence to link him to the murder. Police also determined that he had no motive. He had lied to protect Crystal as she was underage, and he didn't tell officers she was a prostitute because he'd wanted the police to not treat her like she didn't deserve justice because of what she did for a living. Chris was also financially dependent on Crystal, and he didn't have a vehicle, so he alone couldn't have driven her the 45 miles away from Salt Lake City, where she'd been found. Police turned their attention to another suspect, a local cab driver that had an unhealthy obsession with Crystal. However, this lead met a dead end when he was able to be eliminated forensically. As far as leads went, that was all they had. There was foreign male DNA found on a rock that was likely used to bludgeon Crystal, but there was only a partial profile. Officers did compare it to her boyfriend and the cab driver, but neither matched. In 2013, the case was reopened by Detective Todd Bonner. Bonner had been one of the first officers on the scene, and it was a case that would continue to haunt him throughout his career. He had heard of a new DNA collection device that did a better job of pulling DNA from porous objects like rocks. It was called the MVAC, and it essentially worked as a mini vacuum. The MVAC system deploys a unique combination of sterile solution spray and a vacuum that dramatically increases DNA uptake, which is a direct quote from the president of the company that manufactures them. It was a new advancement in technology, and Bonner was excited that it could possibly be used to help solve the case. Bonner had requisitioned one of the devices to be brought in to see what it could get from the rocks collected from the crime scene. Forensic scientists were very pleased when they discovered they had a full DNA profile located on the same rock. They had found the partial DNA profile before they ran the DNA through Cody's and got a hit. 46-year-old Joseph Michael Simpson had previously been convicted of murder and had been on parole at the time of Crystal's murder. Simpson had since relocated to Florida after Crystal's murder. Police were able to locate him living with his mother, and officers were flown out to follow him until they witnessed him discarding something with DNA on it. Simpson was a smoker, and it didn't take officers long to retrieve a cigarette butt he left behind. Investigators compared his DNA to the cigarette butt and DNA on the rock, and it was confirmed to match. He had never been considered a suspect before the DNA link. He was arrested in 2013, and it was Bonner who was able to handcuff Simpson. After 18 years, Detective Bonner was able to call Crystal's mother and tell her that he had arrested her daughter's killer in 2016. He was sentenced to life in prison for aggravated murder, and he was denied any opportunity for parole. It was October 9, 1988 in Battle Creek, Michigan, when Gail Barris disappeared. The 30-year-old single mother of 3 was last seen leaving a coffee shop with a dark-haired man around 3 or 4 a.m. Gail was a bartender and worked at 2 bars to make ends meet. She was known to often frequent this coffee shop after the bars closed on her way home. She was reported missing the following day when she failed to return home, but police didn't have much to go on. There was an account from a witness that she was seen arguing with 2 men near the coffee shop, but police weren't able to get an identification. 16 days later, Gail's body was discovered by hunters. She had been dumped on the side of the road in a neighboring county. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. Oddly, it seems that this case went cold for several decades before being opened again. Two men were persons of interest, a man suspected of kidnapping and assaulting a different woman only a month prior to Gail's murder, Roger Plato and his friend Richard Compton. That woman had survived, and based on her description, the police went to question Roger. When police arrived to bring him in, Plato fled and was shot and killed by officers. Plato died 2 weeks after Gail had disappeared and before her body was even discovered. In 2018, Gail's son, James, called the Battle Creek PD to get a status update on his mother's murder. Detective Scott Marshall then reopened the file and began the investigation from scratch. He had Richard Compton's body exhumed. He had died in 2019, and detectives were able to get a DNA sample, but it didn't match the DNA that was recovered from Gail. Detectives then went to find Roger Plato's remains, but discovered that he, his mother, and his sister had all been cremated. They had records showing that blood was taken from Plato, but the sample wasn't with the rest of the evidence collected. In 2020, an officer with the county sheriff's department was doing an audit of evidence held and taken from Plato as evidence. It seems there had been a miscommunication as to where the sample was supposed to go, but it had never been tested, as it should have been in connection to Gail's cold case. The sample then was shipped to a lab for testing and was a positive match in an unfortunate case of mismanaged paperwork. This case was finally closed after 33 years. No charges will be laid since Plato is deceased, but the case was able to be closed. Her son James thanked Detective Marshall for his dedication to his mother's case. He said, "It will be our way to close this chapter and gather with family and friends at her grave. It won't change the past, but it will take a weight off our shoulders to get this answered." 20-year-old Matthew Pike lived on North Sherwood Street, just above a pub in Nottingham city centre. After moving from Suffolk and dropping out of his physics course, he planned to re-enroll at Nottingham Trent University and was eager to complete his studies. His mother described him as modest, witty, and easygoing, with a great passion for technology. Matthew spent much of his time on his computer, building websites and engaging in online forums. On the internet, he went by the name Shade, while his girlfriend Joanna was known as JoJo. Matthew and Joanna spent a lot of time playing a Nintendo game called Advance Wars, a chess-like, turn-based strategy game centered around defeating opposing armies on different maps, with various mini-tasks in between. Matthew and Joanna often used the now inactive website Advance Wars Bunker. Another user that frequented the site as well was someone under the name Eagle the Lightning, and this user talked to Matthew and Joanna a lot. After Advance Wars Bunker closed down, Matthew, Joanna, and a user by the name of Eggy created and began managing a site called War Central. War Central was focused on the Nintendo Wars series of games, Advance Wars, Battalion Wars, Game Boy Wars, and Famicom Wars. It gave the community that loved the games a place to come together, trading strategies and advice. They quickly developed a small but very loyal following. Eagle the Lightning followed Matthew and Joanna over to War Central, spending up to 8 hours a day on the forum. Before long, it became clear that this user had other motives for spending so much time on there. They had developed a fixation with Joanna that was escalating by the day. The user told people they thought her ginger hair made her more intelligent, and along with her love of gaming and technology, they believed Joanna was their perfect match. Over the coming weeks, months, the contact between this user and Matthew and Joanna became a constant and very exhausting thing. This user was soon discovered to be a German man, 21-year-old David Huis. Little was known about David to the other users, and he kept a lot of his life hidden and separate from his online world. What we do know is that he was the eldest of 2 children, and after his parents' divorce, he went to live with his grandparents. The relationship with his mother and father grew more and more strained, and they eventually stopped speaking almost altogether. He was described as very insular and introverted, with few friends, but he was an exceptional student, excelling in all his classes. He was desperate to attend university but was unable to afford it, and decided to join the military instead. Just 2 weeks after joining, he was discharged due to what the military described as not being mentally suitable. He started an apprenticeship at a textiles company, and when he wasn't doing that, he was guaranteed to be on War Central. He added Joanna on Facebook, totaling his number of friends to 15. The other 14 were all from different parts of the world, presumably being other people he had met online. He would spend a lot of time going through Joanna's profile and messaging her via any outlet he could, sometimes 100 times a day. He soon announced his love for her, and despite Matthew being very much in the picture, he only became more blatant with his feelings. He sent her a Facebook message that read, "I love you, Jojo, more than anything else in my life. I shouldn't, but I can't help it. And to be honest, it's a great feeling. You're my first thought when I wake up and the last one when I go to sleep." Joanna repeatedly ignored his messages and tried not to worry about it too much, thinking the obsession would soon wear off. After all, David was 100 miles away in a different country, and Joanna and Matthew were always very careful and private about their personal lives. Joanna said she never worried about anyone finding out where they lived, as it was not information they revealed or ever put out there on any platform. But in June of 2008, Matthew and Joanna went on a short holiday. To their shock, they arrived back at their flat to find David Heiss down the outside the front door waiting for them. Conveniently, he said he had no money with him and nowhere to stay. When they asked him how he found out where they'd lived, he claimed Joanna had once posted it on her Facebook page, something which Joanna couldn't ever remember or imagine doing. Understandably unnerved by this, Joanna started ringing around some local hostels to try and book him somewhere to stay. But when they had no luck, David insisted he just stay with them. He slept on the floor in their room in a sleeping bag. Joanna recalled not sleeping that night, as every time she looked over, he was wide awake and staring at her. David stayed with them for 3 days before Joanna convinced him to head off and meet some more of his online friends while he was in the UK. After 3 weeks of traveling around, he finally returned to Germany. Matthew, who had now reached his limits, contacted him and said, "I hate you for ever laying eyes on the girl I've dedicated my life to. I hate you for your desperation." Matthew then took to the War Central forum and put out a post called "The 19 Reasons Why I Hate David Heiss." David was humiliated and infuriated, and despite his attempts to change people's minds, other users began distancing themselves from him too. Just weeks later, David took his uncle's car to drive to the couple's home again. While he was traveling down the motorway, he collided with a truck. This was no deterrent, however, and as soon as he was deemed fit to leave the hospital, he headed over to the flats just as he had planned. Enough was enough, and the couple sent him away. They knew they had to cut him off completely and blocked him from accessing the War Central forum. Many other users cut off contact with him as well. Joanna emailed the troubling David, urging him to seek help and go and talk to a therapist. David replied, "Joe, one day I will break my promise and come back to Nottingham and offer you a knife or something and tell you to kill me because I don't want to live without you." For the next 2 months, the shaken pair heard nothing from David Heiss. But in early September, Matthew received an email from him. It read, "There's something I would like to give to you. I'm not going to say what it is though. You will love it." On September 18th, 2008, David's obsession would take its darkest turn yet. He packed some warm clothes, some gardening gloves, and a knife before boarding a plane from Germany to England via Amsterdam, his third trip in 3 months. When he arrived, he stayed in the station for a while looking for a tram to get. When he realized they were no longer running, he proceeded to walk through the town at 1 a.m. When he reached North Sherwood Street, he got onto the roof of the couple's flat and slept behind an air conditioning unit all night. That same evening, Joanna and Matthew celebrated their 3-year anniversary. At 6:55 a.m., David watched Joanna leave for work before forcing his way into the flat. He launched a savage and prolonged attack on Matthew, stabbing him a total of 86 times. It was clear from the location of the blood that he had chased Matthew around the flat for a while, with Matthew stumbling into walls and doors as he had tried to escape. After this, he threw some clothes and belongings around the flats, presumably attempting to make it look like a burglary, before he fled the area, leaving Matthew for dead. In Matthew's final moments, he crawled over to his computer and wrote DAV, the first 3 letters of David's name, in his own blood on the side of the monitor. A truly heartbreaking thought, but Matthew's immense determination to identify David and tell people what had happened showcased his strength until the very end. He succumbed to his numerous injuries shortly thereafter. Before catching his 1:20 p.m. flight, David walked up and down the street dumping things in different bins. When analyzing the CCTV, it was clear that David was struggling to walk, partly due to a cut on his leg that had happened during the fight, and partly because the shoes he was determined to be wearing in the clip weren't his. His own shoes were covered in blood, and without a spare pair, he had taken Matthew's, which were a few sizes too small. He also disposed of the knife, which was never found before getting on a flight home just 16 hours after landing in the United Kingdom. It appeared that David had wanted to make the murder look like Matthew had taken his own life. In an attempt to give himself an alibi, he asked his sister to log onto some sites under his Eagle the Lightning username. In his suitcase were 2 suicide notes, one for him and one that was made to look like Matthew had written it. But for whatever reason, he didn't leave any notes at the scene. Police theorized that due to how bloody and violent the scene was, there was simply no way that anyone would believe Matthew could have done that to himself. There was no other possible suspect, and police began corresponding with the authorities in Lindbergh to track down David Heiss. Joanna had given them a huge amount of information, including the car crash he was in while driving to their home. As the authorities had been involved in this, his address was soon located. He was arrested 4 days later and stayed in custody awaiting extradition to the United Kingdom. In a final callous act of desperation, he wrote a letter to Joanna from prison, telling her he hoped they could be together when everything was over. David quickly admitted to killing Matthew, claiming self-defense, but police had numerous amounts of evidence that pointed to it being very much a premeditated killing. A search of his house showed the suitcase that he was seen traveling with, and inside it was the pair of bloody gardening gloves he had worn that day. During David's trial, he stuck to his story. Matthew was the aggressor and David had stabbed him to defend himself. He said that he had traveled to England to confront Matthew and Joanna after they had started abusing him online. He said that he wanted to scare Matthew in the hopes that it would stop what he referred to as constant hostilities. He charged at me. I was trying to push his arms away so they wouldn't make contact with me. He lost the knife when it fell to the floor near the table. He tried to crawl towards it, but I tried to prevent it by sitting on him. After a few seconds, I got hold of it. He started kicking me in the back and he was looking at me angrily. I was lucky that I was still alive. I don't know if it was adrenaline, but I managed to get my arm away, and then I stabbed him. The prosecution said this was totally convoluted, and the placement of blood at the scene, as well as the fact that apart from the small cut, David had no injuries, told a very clear and different story. Mr. Justice Keith told David, "The fact your motive for the murder was so bizarre doesn't make your killing of Matthew any less serious. The tragedy is that you are unable to cope with rejection." In May 2009, David Heiss was found guilty of the murder of Matthew Pike and was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 18 years that he must serve before he can be considered for parole. None of David Heiss's family were present for the trial. Matthew's family issued a statement. "We will never truly come to terms with what happened to Matthew that morning. While we have wanted justice throughout the course of this trial, all we really want is Matthew back with us. There will always be a massive part of our family missing, and not a day goes by without us thinking about Matthew and what might have been. It's not fair that we should all have to live like this for the rest of our lives because of one man's actions. He has taken a wonderful, caring, loving young man from all of us. We hope this verdict will give us some kind of closure so that we can try and move on with our lives. But that is easier said than done." Joanna and Eggy continued running War Central for a while, where they made a tribute page for Matthew, which was always flooded with people sharing their memories and love for him. They went on to create Wars Wiki, the encyclopedia for all Nintendo Wars games. It was made as a dedication and a tribute to Matthew Pike. On August 24, 1998, Sandra Better was working a closing shift alone at Lucia's consignment store in Delray Beach, Florida. Just weeks away from retirement, the 68-year-old enjoyed her job at the store, despite not needing to work. As a wife and mother of 3 grown daughters, she preferred being at the store, surrounded by people, to being at home. The store, located in a strip mall renowned for its excellent thrift stores, was filled with vintage furniture, decor, and collectibles. Her husband, Zeke Better, fondly remembered her enthusiasm for the store and her enjoyment of getting dressed up for work. The two had just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The couple had met in Brooklyn, New York in 1948 and had been happily married ever since. The two had plans to go back to New York to renew their vows, and the trip was to take place after her last shift at the store. On that August day, two teenagers had walked by the consignment store and noticed it was still open 30 minutes after it normally closed. They popped in to check to see if the store was still open and, to their shock, found Sandra, beaten and covered in blood, lying on the store's floor. 911 was called and EMTs determined that Sandra had died of her wounds. She had been stabbed several times and her throat had a large gash. There was a massive amount of blood all throughout the store. Sandra had several defensive injuries on her hands and arms, indicating she had fought her attacker hard. The cash register had been emptied, leading the police to believe that that may have been the motive. However, the killer didn't take Sandra's Rolex watch or the large diamond engagement ring she wore. Police had a witness statement made by a customer who'd been in the store about half-hour before the teens had made the horrific discovery. She described being in the store with Sandra and a Caucasian man who was tall, skinny, and haggling the price of a couch with Sandra. Another witness said she briefly popped into the store right before closing time and saw a man at the cash register talking to the store clerk. The descriptions matched the other witness's account. She didn't stay in the store long, nor did she remember seeing anyone else in the store. Police set up a sketch and released it to the media. The best evidence found in the shop was that it appeared the killer had cut himself in the process of murdering Sandra. Although it was mostly Sandra's blood tracked throughout the store, there was another person's blood on the cash register, door, and a set of decorative balls near Sandra. There were also fingerprints which, along with the blood, were put in the national databases. There were no media hits, and without any further leads, the case went cold. Police had interviewed 37 suspects. One man who had gone to the hospital that day with a laceration on his hand, another who had been reported to police for abruptly leaving town and relocating to the Midwest, and a man who was far too interested in the investigation. None matched the killer's DNA or prints. Zeke Better, devastated by the loss of his wife, set up a scholarship fund for criminal justice students in his wife's name. He also spent every remaining year of his life volunteering for the Delray Beach Police Department until his death in 2015. In 2018, the Delray Beach Police Department got an unexpected call. After 20 years, they had received a fingerprint match on the Sandra Better murder case. The prints belonged to Todd Barkett, a 51-year-old man living in Brandon, Florida, who had applied for a job as a nursing assistant, which had required him to submit fingerprints for a criminal record check. Back in 1998, Barkett had been living in a mobile home near Lantana, 10 miles from Delray Beach. He also matched the suspect's description. He was 6'2" with light hair, and even 20 years later, he was still very slim. Barkett was never a suspect before his prints came up. He had a minimal criminal history, mostly traffic citations. He had married and he'd been working at a retirement home for many years. When his picture was shown to one of the witnesses, she immediately picked him out of a group, identifying him as a man she saw in the store right before Sandra's murder. He was arrested in March 2018 and police were able to get a DNA sample and match it to the blood found on the cash register and the door. Police also noted a significant scar running from the right side of his mouth down under the right side of his chin. Marquette said he had been attacked by a dog, but police compared the scar to his driver license, noting he had the scar after his 2002 license renewal photo. When the case went to trial, Barkett pleaded not guilty. His lawyers argued he had gone to the store that day with a cut on his hand and touched a few of the items. He said no one was at the cash register and decided to steal the money on impulse. He denied ever murdering Sandra. But jurors didn't buy the story after only a 90-minute deliberation. They came back with a guilty verdict. Todd Barkett was found guilty on August 23, 2019 for the murder of Sandra Better and sentenced to life in prison. On November 17, 1997, Jane Morton Antonez left her parents' home at 7:30 p.m. Recently divorced, the 30-year-old woman had moved back in with her parents in Atascadero, California, while she sorted out the next chapter of her life. That evening, she was supposed to go to her best friend's house, but never arrived. The following morning, Jane's family discovered that Jane was neither at home nor with her friend. After calling around and not locating her, Her older brother offered to drive around and see if he could find her car. The car was parked on a side road off of Highway 101 and was only a mile from the house. As he got closer to the vehicle, he immediately knew something wasn't right, and he made the grisly discovery of his sister's lifeless body. Jane was in the back seat of the vehicle. Her throat slit and she'd been sexually assaulted. There was little evidence as to what had happened. Jane didn't pick up hitchhikers and there weren't any obvious mechanical issues with the vehicle. No clues as to how someone had gotten to her. Her case quickly went cold, but it wasn't the only tragedy to hit Atascadero. 2 months following Jane's murder, Patricia Dwyer, a 28-year-old woman, was found murdered in her home. She had been stabbed in the chest and had also been sexually assaulted. In both cases, the women had had their hands similarly tied behind their backs. As we know from the Golden State Killer attacks, knot tying can be very distinctive. Although close in age and having few mutual acquaintances, the women didn't know each other, nor did they have any overlapping interests the night Patricia was murdered. She had told a friend that afternoon that she had plans to go to the grocery store and needed to get some cleaning done. The same friend had popped over for her visit the following day and discovered Patricia's body. The investigation immediately connected the 2 women slain, but much like the first murder, there was little to go on. There were no signs of forced entry into Patricia's home, but police also acknowledged that Patricia kept a key under the doormat to her front door. Police had been very public with their opinion that they were looking for one perpetrator. They handed out hundreds of flyers with the cases on them, hopeful that someone remembered something of value to the case, but they used the campaign to remind women to lock their cars, lock their homes, and to not let strangers into their homes or vehicles. By the fall of 1978, both cases were cold. None of the suspects panned out, and years later, one by one, they were cleared by DNA. In 2005, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office reopened the case and uploaded samples of the DNA collected from the crime scenes to the national databases. There were no immediate hits, but the DNA would continually be sampled randomly in the automatic system. On June 21, 2017, the case was given new light when the sheriff's detective, Clint Cole, reopened the case again. His investigation led to opening up the search to include familial matches in the national databases, and after 40 years, they had a clear lead. The close familial match happened to be an incarcerated inmate, and it only took investigators a brief conversation to get a lead suspect. Arthur Rudy Martinez had lived in Atascadero in 1977 and then moved in the winter of 1978. He had been a suspect in the initial investigation, but there was no evidence to tie him to the crimes at the time. In 1977, Martinez had been on parole for attempted murder and rape charges. He'd also been working as a welder in the area, but after the murder of Patricia Dwyer, he relocated to Spokane, Washington. While in Washington, he committed multiple robberies and sexual assaults, and he was charged and sentenced to life in prison. In 1994, he escaped prison and lived in Fresno, California area for 20 years. In 2014, he turned himself in to authorities because he had cancer and needed to receive medical treatments. His decision to turn himself in came too late, and 2 months after returning to prison, he died from cancer. Detectives were able to track down Martinez's girlfriend, and she had a box of his personal effects. The box contained his razor, and from that investigators were able to pull enough DNA to test it against the semen DNA collected from 1977. The samples matched, officially linking Martinez to the assaults of Jane Morton Antonez and Patricia Dwyer. Unfortunately, there will be no additional charges laid or a criminal trial, however. Another cold case can be closed. February 16, 1974 in Fort Worth, Texas was a day full of excitement. That Saturday, Carla Walker spent the afternoon getting ready for a Valentine's Day dance at her high school. Carla was 17, a cheerleader, and a very popular Spitfire who had her whole life ahead of her. Carla was to attend the dance with her boyfriend, Rodney. He was a year older than her and a quarterback of the football team. Friends described the couple as the perfect high school sweetheart. Friends said that Carla's family adored Rodney. Though they were young, the couple had already started making plans for their future, and Carla's family already considered Rodney a part of their family, welcoming him with open arms. The dance was full of fun, full of laughter, and although the event was chaperoned, teens have a way of eluding authority. Rodney said that the couple partook in sipping from a flask and smoked a small amount of pot. Carla and Rodney left the dance a little early with a group of friends. The group went to a local eatery and grabbed some snacks and hung out for a bit. Carla and Rodney bid their friends good night and drove off. The teens didn't head straight home. Instead, the couple went to a popular hangout, the local bowling alley. They went in briefly to use the washrooms, then returned to the car. The parking lot was close to empty, and they had parked in an even more secluded area. They were sitting in the back seat of the car, chatting, laughing, and the two began kissing. Carla was leaned against the passenger door. They were absorbed in their activities and didn't notice a man approach the vehicle. The stranger opened the passenger door, and because Carla had been leaning her full body weight on the door, she quickly tumbled out of the car. Rodney had attempted to grab her. When the man repeatedly started hitting Rodney in the head with something hard, the stranger put the object against his head. And only then did Rodney realize the item was a pistol. Rodney heard Carla say, "I'll go with you. Just don't shoot him." Rodney heard the gun go off once, and he thought he'd been shot. The man then pointed the gun in his face and pulled the trigger a couple of times, but the gun made an empty click. The gun wasn't loaded. The assailant then hit Rodney again with the weapon, and this time Rodney was knocked unconscious. Rodney didn't see the man lead his girlfriend away. The last thing he remembered was Carlo screaming, "Go get my dad." Rodney didn't know how much time had passed before he regained consciousness. He jumped back into the car and drove on autopilot to Carla's house. He tumbled through their front door covered in blood. Carla's father then drove to the bowling alley, which now was closed and was joined by police. Police and volunteers undertook an extensive search. They searched by foot, by horseback, and by helicopter. Rodney's description of the man was clean-cut, Caucasian, slender. He had clean-cut, Caucasian, slender. He had short wavy hair, a thick Texas drawl, average height, and was wearing a shiny green sleeveless vest and a white cowboy hat. At the abduction site, police found a magazine for a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. While Rodney was the initial suspect, police didn't have much to go on. After 3 days of searching, police discovered Carla's body. She was partially clad in a ditch near Lake Benbrook. Police determined there had been evidence to suggest Carla had been held captive, tortured, sexually assaulted, and injected with morphine. The autopsy estimated her time of death of Monday, meaning she had been held captive for roughly 24 to 36 hours. Her cause of death was strangulation. Police received 200 tips from the public, and several suspects were investigated. One such man was a previously convicted car thief who lived less than a mile from the bowling alley. Glenn Samuel McCurley was a truck driver who was off work the night of the abduction and had no alibi because his wife was away that weekend. He was initially picked up because he had recently purchased new bullets for his .22 caliber Ruger pistol, a gun that had matched the magazine that was found at the abduction site. He had said his gun had been stolen while he had been fishing. The date he gave for the theft of the weapon was around the same time as Carla's abduction, and he told police he hadn't reported it stolen because he had a criminal record. He was eventually released because there was no evidence to directly link him to the crime, and police focused on other suspects. Over the years, several people came forward attaching themselves to the case. However, all were able to be eliminated. Police did have key evidence but needed to wait until technology could catch up. DNA was found on Carla's clothing and preserved in the 1990s. The DNA was input into the national databases, but nothing came up in April 2019. Police received a letter from a person claiming to be the man who had abducted and murdered Carla. Police put that letter out on social media and asked for the man to come forward in September 2019. Police joined forces with Ortham Incorporated, a private lab in Texas. Ortham was able to pull a full genetic profile of the suspect. Using familial genealogy, the lab was able to reverse engineer a family tree. They were able to narrow it down to 3 brothers, all with the last name McCurley. Cold case investigators recognized the last name as it matched one of the initial suspects. In July of 2019, police collected a sample of McCurley's DNA from discarded trash. Following a positive match, they were able to obtain an arrest warrant. After his arrest, he submitted 2 additional DNA samples, which both tested positive. This solidified investigators' belief they had found the right man. 46 investigators believed they had found the right man 46 years after Carla's murder. Her killer would face a grand jury now 77. Glenn Samuel McCurley faces a capital murder charge and is being held on a $100,000 bond after the arrest. Carla's family said it brought them relief to have answers and justice for Carla. Finally, hopefully, it also brought a relief to Rodney, now in his 60s, who has lived his entire adult life hid under a cloud of suspicion. Although he was never a named suspect, there was always a cloud of doubt in the court of public opinion that followed him. At this time, there are no further court dates. McCurley has not obtained legal counsel, though there will likely be updated court dates in the new year. On October 16, 1985, Danielle Sarah Jones was born to Tony and Linda in Essex, England. She grew up with her parents and two younger brothers. Her mother recalled that as a toddler, Danielle was very happy and delightful, though not particularly confident. As she grew older, Danielle remained a homely child with a great sense of humor, but she was still quite shy. Despite her lack of self-confidence, she maintained a large group of friends. One of her biggest passions were animals, and she adored her two young rabbits. One member of the family that Danielle had grown close to was her uncle. Tony's sister was married to a man called Stuart Campbell from Grays, Essex. The father of two worked as a builder, and when Danielle and her brothers were small, their uncle would spend time with them and play with them, treating his nephews and niece exactly the same. Linda said that he was a bit of a charmer, but also full of himself. When talking about the relationship between him and her husband Tony, she said that although they got along, there was something about Stuart Campbell that Tony didn't like. When Stuart married Tony's sister, Danielle had served as a bridesmaid, and Stuart Campbell was now part of the family. Campbell's presence had caused tensions. Linda and Tony had become frustrated with his constant intrusion. As Danielle grew older, he had taken a particular interest in her. He would meet Danielle off the bus as she got in from school. He would stand outside his van making sure that everybody knew he was there. Danielle was embarrassed by this and didn't like the extra attention it brought to her. He would come to the house 4 or 5 times a week, to the point that Linda and Tony were becoming fed up with it. On one occasion, Tony recalled Stuart sitting on the sofa next to Danielle. He was repeatedly asking his niece, "Why are you embarrassed, Danielle? Why are you going so red?" When Tony intervened and asked what the problem was, Campbell brushed it off and said that there was no problem at all. Danielle had apparently tried to disengage with his behavior, but Campbell resisted. This was an incredibly difficult situation for Linda and Tony. If they confronted Campbell about his behavior and were wrong, it could cause immeasurable damage in the family. Also, all they had were seemingly isolated incidents that Campbell could explain away as innocent misunderstandings. On the morning she had gone missing, Danielle's brother was watching from the window. He saw her turn left as she went out of the gate, which was her normal route to school. Seconds later, he watched as she turned around and began walking the other way. She was also seen by 2 schoolboys who assumed that she could have been heading to a nearby shop, but she could have also caught the bus to school heading in that direction too. When the call came from Danielle's school, Linda was horrified. She knew their daughter was not a rule breaker and would never have bunked off. Her father said that even in the unlikely event that she had skipped school, she would certainly be home as soon as the sun started to go down. Danielle was afraid of the dark and would never have stayed out late. Her friends and family continued to text and call her. Danielle never answered. This was completely out of character for Danielle. She would often leave her mother notes telling her where she was going, if it was next door or to a friend's house, and she would always call when she got there. As family and friends went out and trolled the estate for her, Linda didn't leave the house or lock the door in case Danielle contacted them or came home. Tony went round to his sister's house. He couldn't get a response, but upon looking through the window, Tony saw camera equipment set up in the living room, which he found bizarre. It also seemed strange that everyone was out looking for Danielle, except Stuart Campbell. Linda said Tony was agitated when he arrived home, frustrated with his brother-in-law that he wasn't searching for her. It wasn't just her family who were incredibly concerned. Detective Superintendent Peter Coltman of Essex Police explained that Danielle's school friends were deeply worried and were actively seeking the help of police to also try and find her. Linda stayed awake most of the night, hoping that her daughter would walk back through the front door. As night fell, Danielle still hadn't come home. The police arrived at the house with sniffer dogs and went through the estate. They established the route that she had taken. They ascertained that she had walked and then retraced her steps. Her mother said that she was in shock and continuing to cling to the hope that her daughter was still alive and going to come home. In the 3 days that followed, searches were made of the family home, but nothing of relevance was found. The search soon expanded, and every house in the village of East Tilbury was visited by the police. The residents were spoken to and asked to check their sheds and outbuildings to ensure that she wasn't hiding. The response from the public was huge. Linda said the support from the community was absolutely outstanding. For weeks today since Danielle went missing, Tasking Today for Teens 23 will be a footpath that runs from Fox Lane to a railway bridge at Linford in Essex. The drivers will be continuing today at the lake nearest to the East Tilbury village. There's tire tracks, footmarks on one area of that lake where they'll be paying particular attention. As the hours ticked by and with still nothing from Danielle, hope began to fade, and the police were becoming increasingly convinced that something awful had happened to her. They referred the case up to the major investigation team. DC Ed Mayo was assigned to be the family liaison officer, whose job it is to support the family through the case and provide them with updates as and when the police get them. Family liaison officers provide that vital link between the family and the investigating team. As the investigation escalated, it was vital for Ed to build a rapport with the family and understand their dynamics. This would help determine what kind of girl Danielle was and how the family unit worked. Her parents raised their concerns with the police about her relationship with Stuart. Now that she had gone missing, they were concerned about what that relationship actually was. Danielle had now been missing for 3 days, and suspicion was on one person, Stuart Campbell. Initial inquiries by Gray's police are then confirmed by the major investigation team, centered around a blue van. But witnesses seen the driver of a blue van talking to Danielle. There was also a sighting of a girl matching Danielle's description, having an altercation with a man in a blue van. Danielle's uncle Stuart Campbell owned a blue van. Once this information came to light, it confirmed the worst fears of officers. She had most likely been abducted. A press conference was quickly set up, and the media interest in the story continued to grow. When someone goes missing, the press is vital in circulating names, photographs, and descriptions, hopefully generating new leads for the police. As the interest in Stuart Campbell continued to mount, the police dug into his background. What they found was horrifying. He had forcibly detained a 14-year-old girl in his house and taken indecent photographs of her. He entered a plea of guilty for this offense. Having served a year on remand, he was freed at the end of the trial. Whilst Linda and Tony knew that he had had a run-in with the law, when they asked questions they were told it was nothing and all a big mistake. Linda would later say that she and Tony had been led to believe that he had been acquitted. Further investigations by the police found 30 victims over a 20-year period. His modus operandi was always the same. He would pose as a glamour photographer and hand out business cards with his details on them. He would lure unsuspecting victims back to his house and proceed to take indecent pictures of them under the guise that they were going to be glamour shots. Following his arrest for detaining the 14-year-old, he was able to manipulate the family into thinking that he was the innocent victim in a big misunderstanding. Police were now so concerned about Campbell, they either needed to eliminate him or find evidence that implicated him. He was placed under surveillance, but his behavior only exaggerated their concerns. He didn't seem to be a concerned uncle whose niece was missing. He spent time driving to car parks taking photographs of silver cars which matched the description of his own Nissan Primera. It appeared he was trying to build an alibi for himself. Following the surveillance that lasted for several hours, the police had to make a decision. It was important for the investigating team to weigh up all the possibilities. It was vital that they didn't risk Danielle's life if she was still alive and being held captive by Campbell, but also that they didn't risk the possibility of him leading them to her. 5 days after she was last seen, at around midnight, Stuart Campbell was placed under arrest. As Danielle had moved into her teenage years, her relationship with her father could occasionally be strained. with Linda saying it appeared to be nothing more than what can happen with teenage girls and their fathers. Campbell spoke of this during his interview, saying that prior to Danielle going missing, the family was at their breaking point. Campbell's alibi was that he had been at a DIY shop in Raleigh. He hadn't purchased anything, which the investigating team found strange. He said that he was returning home but was delayed, and that he had telephoned his wife to inform her of this. He said that after getting home, he went to his neighbor's house to do some decking. Following these interviews and despite his refusal to cooperate, the police did not have enough to hold him in custody any longer. He was released on bail pending further inquiries. Detective Superintendent Peter Coltman said that the prospect of releasing Campbell worried him as he believed he was a highly dangerous offender. The police needed evidence. Everything was checked and then checked again. During a search of Danielle's room, a pencil case was found. Inside it were 2 notes, the first of which read, "Hi Princess, hope you have a lovely holiday. Text me when you get back. Love, Stuart. Kiss." The second one read, "Hi Princess. In case you missed my last note, I just thought I'd pop in another to let you know that I do miss your smile. Kiss, kiss." In the weeks before Danielle had gone missing, she had gone on holiday with her family. While they were away, Campbell had gone into Danielle's bedroom and left her the notes. She didn't talk about this with her mother, but she did confide in a friend. Her friend was incredibly concerned, wondering how he had got into the house and why he had crossed that line with his niece. Campbell had previously done some work on the house and fitted a new back door. While the police were never able to find the keys, they believed that he did have a key to that house. Simultaneous searches were also carried out on Stuart Campbell's family home, a semi-detached house on Meadow Road. The police found a plethora of photography equipment, alongside indecent images that he had taken of young girls. They also found he had indecent images of children which he had downloaded off the internet. When the search moved up into the loft, a bag was found hidden. The bag contained many disturbing items, including lingerie and handcuffs. Police believe that when Campbell got a young girl to his house, he would use the contents of this bag and take indecent photographs of his victims. Also in the bag, police found a pair of white stockings. While perhaps innocuous at first glance, when seen in the context of the rest of the items that had been found, these were a vital piece of evidence. On the stockings was a small amount of blood. The stockings were sent away to be tested. When the results of the testing carried out on the white stockings came back, it contained a mixture of Campbell's and Danielle's DNA. As part of their search, his vehicle was removed, a blue van. Detective Chief Superintendent Steve Reynolds told the BBC that Campbell had developed a relationship with Danielle that was certainly inappropriate and probably unlawful. The police could not reveal that they suspected Stuart Campbell of murdering his niece. They could only reveal an offender's name once they had been charged. The response from the public was enormous. People turned out in droves to help conduct searches of the Thames near to Danielle's home. It was described as having an eerie silence and a steely determination to find Danielle, and people would search for her for as long as it took. Danielle's family continued to hold onto the hope that she could still be alive. But as the police extended their search to deep water and abandoned buildings, their hope began to fade. Stuart Campbell was keen to show officers a text message that he had received. It was from his niece's phone. It read, "Hi Stu, what you up to? I'm in so much trouble." Police also discovered that on the day she had disappeared, a text had been sent from her phone to Campbell. It read, "Hi Stu, thanks for being so nice. You're the best uncle ever. Tell Mom I'm so sorry. Love you loads. Dan. Kiss, kiss, kiss." It appeared that Danielle was still alive. While this had renewed her parents' hope, they were incredibly upset that she still hadn't made direct contact with them or come home. This hope was short-lived, however. When piecing the bits of the puzzle together, from the evidence found in his home to his history with young girls, this text message was an incredibly sinister development. In light of this, the major investigation team drafted in several experts, including a telephone expert. This cemented the police's belief that Campbell had lied about being in the DIY store in Raleigh. Cell site analysis was conducted regarding the phone call he had allegedly made to his wife. It concluded the call had not been made in Raleigh, but rather in the East Tilbury, Corringham area. Police also brought in a forensic linguist to analyze the language used in the 2 text messages compared to the ones they knew had been sent by Danielle before she went missing. One thing that immediately stood out was the spelling of the word what. The text message to Campbell showed it as WOT. Danielle never spelled it like this. She spelled it correctly when texting. Analysis showed that both his phone and Danielle's phone had been within the range of the same single phone mast when that text message was sent to him. Investigations also revealed that his phone and Danielle's phone were together near his home for around 30 hours after she vanished. In a bid to generate new leads and any new information, her devastated family appealed to the press. "I'm so desperate to get her back. Please protect yourself." Excited, really. The case would soon be picked up by the BBC show Crime Watch. And 4 weeks after she had gone missing, an episode about Danielle would air. Her parents were interviewed as part of this episode. Her father said he did not believe that she would have run away. Linda begged for anyone with information to talk to the police. She said she understood that it was scary to come forward, but that it was necessary for them to find their daughter. Stuart Campbell had to answer his bail. Detective Chief Superintendent Steve Reynolds of the Major Investigation Team said that based on the indecent images of the girls that had been found in his home, he was arrested and charged with these offenses, and he was taken to Harlow Police Station to be questioned by detectives. In the background, police continued to build their case against Campbell for Danielle's murder. Campbell's brother Alex visited him shortly after his arrest. He said, "The police asked me, could you go and talk to him? Then come back and just tell us your gut feeling? Tell us what you think." I went to see him, and within 10 minutes I knew he was lying. And there's never been any shadow of doubt in my mind since that moment. As the police continued to update Danielle's family, they were devastated that the man they thought they knew, they really didn't know at all. Linda would later say that one of Campbell's tactics was to drive wedges between fathers and daughters, just like in his previous interview when he insinuated that the family home was not a happy one. His manipulation was further brought to light when it emerged that he would speak to Danielle and tell her he wouldn't put up with her family if he was her. He would then go and talk to her parents, saying that he had spoke with Danielle and things would get easier, thus playing Linda and Tony off against their daughter, all while maintaining a facade of trying to be helpful. Campbell also kept a diary the police would later refer to as the Danielle Diary. Any contact he had with her, whether it was a call or a text message, he would record. It was obvious that he was becoming not only more obsessed with her, but increasingly dangerous. There was one instance that also highlighted his incredibly manipulative ways. He had taken Danielle shopping and then out to the cinema. She mentioned to her friend that during this trip, Campbell had held her hand. Her friend's father was concerned by this. He would later say in a documentary, "I don't think at that stage it was for me to take the matter up with Lynn and Tony because I didn't want to upset Lynn and Tony's relationship with Tony's family. Could have been construed as me interfering, and I didn't think at that point in time that was the right thing to do." Campbell played on the fact that Danielle was growing up and used that to flatter her and draw her into his lies. The CPS decided that although Danielle's body hadn't been found, the police had enough evidence to charge Stuart Campbell with kidnap and murder. Following this, he would be on remand for the next 11 months. Despite Campbell being charged with her murder, police had more than 800 sightings from throughout the UK and Europe purporting to be Danielle. This provided a massive logistical problem for Essex police. Every sighting had to be investigated and eliminated. If there was even the slightest chance that she was alive and that particular sighting had not been investigated, it would be easy for the defense to raise that during the trial and raise a shadow of doubt that Danielle was still alive, meaning the case of murder could not be proven. Before the trial, and with one of their sons being called as a witness, Linda and Tony took both their boys to the court to familiarize them with the surroundings and help them prepare for the proceedings that were to follow. Linda said that Danielle's brothers were both devastated and hugely affected by her disappearance. She said that one was very matter-of-fact, and the other was deeply angry. It wasn't just the impending trial that caused the Jones family unimaginable stress. Tony was self-employed and had had to return to work at his dry cleaning business. However, Linda had given up her part-time cleaning job. Linda explained in a documentary that Stuart's link to Tony's side of the family had caused tension between them, saying, "I know it's not his fault, but it's caused me some resentment." She explained that Tony was understanding and knew that she was simply venting her anger about the situation. She spoke about how even simple tasks like washing and ironing clothes was now incredibly difficult for her, as she had no clothes of Danielle's to do. In a documentary that followed the family in the year after Danielle's disappearance, Tony explained that there had been a falling out with his parents and sister too. It's gone too far now to get back together. In the months leading up to the trial, the search effort was increased to try and find her body. Not only was this about finding vital evidence that could help complete the puzzle, this was about giving her family the peace of mind they desperately needed and deserved. They needed to be able to lay her to rest and have their questions answered. 12 days before the trial, a body was found in Hampshire. The police quickly cordoned off the area and conducted inquiries to try and ascertain who it was. As the family, press, and public waited for news, the results came in. Millie Dowler was a schoolgirl who had been murdered by serial killer Levi Belfield. He would not face justice for her murder for another 10 years. Hers was a case that would spark national outrage and inquiry into phone hacking and would bring one of the United Kingdom's biggest newspapers to its knees. Tragically for the Jones family, they were now back at square one. It was time for the family to hold a pre-trial press conference. Facing the media was a mammoth task for the family. It was now time for the trial of Stuart Campbell. The man who had married into their family, the man they had trusted, the man who had put on a front of being a loving uncle, stood accused of the kidnap and murder of Danielle Jones. It was scheduled to last for 8 weeks at Chelmsford Crown Court. A journalist described Campbell as having an air of confidence about him, seemingly unfazed by the magnitude of the charges leveled against him. As they still had not found a body, the case of the prosecution was circumstantial, and they would need to convince a jury that Danielle had been murdered. The prosecution's case was that unbeknownst to Tony and Linda, Stuart Campbell had been grooming Danielle, launching a campaign of manipulation, obsessing over her, and driving a wedge between her and her parents. This was the first time her parents had seen him since Danielle's disappearance. Despite the rage and pain they felt, Linda and Tony sat in the courtroom and came face to face with the man who had ripped their family apart. The prosecution's case was reliant on several pieces of evidence. On the morning she was last seen, she had been seen talking to a man in a blue van similar to the one owned by Campbell. She had gone missing without being in contact with her parents. The blood-stained stockings that contained DNA, matching both Campbell and Danielle. His diary revealing his obsession with teenage girls, and containing testimonies that he had manipulated young girls into posing for topless photographs. Another key piece of evidence were the text messages that Campbell claimed Danielle had sent to him. These did not match the patterns usually seen in messages sent by Danielle. Her messages were sent in lowercase as opposed to these messages sent in all caps. Forensic authorship analysis indicated that Campbell was the author, and that this had been done in an attempt to prove that Danielle was still alive. Records from the mobile switching center revealed Campbell's false alibi. His claim that he had been in Raleigh 30 minutes away at a DIY store could not be backed up by the mobile phone records. Analysis showed that both his phone and Danielle's phone had been within the range of the same single phone mast when the messages were sent. Investigations also revealed that his phone and Danielle's phone were together near his home for around 30 hours after she had vanished. Whilst Campbell was quiet throughout the trial, he was often passing notes to his legal team if he was not happy with one of the witnesses, showcasing his need to be in control of what was being asked to each witness. After an 11-week trial, the jury had reached their verdict. Stuart Campbell was found guilty by a majority of the abduction and murder of Danielle Jones. He was sentenced to life in prison for her murder. This was to run concurrently with his 10-year sentence for abduction. Later, the High Court would rule that he must serve at least 20 years before he can be considered for parole. The police were due to speak with him on Christmas Eve, but Campbell refused. Following his conviction in 2004, Campbell was granted leave to appeal. His lawyers argued that the trial judge, Mr. Justice McKinnon, should have excluded highly prejudicial evidence to the effect that Campbell had a fixation for young girls in taking photographs of them and had downloaded material about teenage girls from the internet. They also urged Lord Justice Kennedy, Mr. Justice Simon, and Mr. Justice Bean to rule that as one of the jurors lived next door but one to a police officer involved in the case, and that a senior investigating officer lived in the same village, they should have been discharged from the jury. In 2005, this appeal was dismissed by the Court of Appeal. The verdict of the inquest into Danielle's death was returned. It was ruled as an unlawful killing. Police interviewed Campbell in custody, and he refused to cooperate or tell officers where Danielle was. Following the case of Danielle Jones, the use of text message evidence also had wide-reaching impact. The University of Leicester had a group of researchers to begin studying the various text messaging styles under the hypothesis that forensic research into authorship analysis might prove helpful in future criminal cases. It was announced that Essex and Kent police had started searching a garage block in Thurrock after receiving new information. It was later announced that following the search, no discovery had been made. In 2019, Linda backed the Campaign for Helen's Law, named after murder victim Helen McCourt, making killers ineligible for parole if they do not tell police where they've hidden the body of a victim. This followed the tireless campaign of Marie McCourt, Helen's mother. Helen was a 22-year-old insurance clerk who was murdered in 1988. Her murderer Ian Sims has never revealed her body's location. The petition calling for Helen's Law had more than 600,000 signatures and high-level government support. In November 2020, Helen's Law received royal assent. Under the law, killers could still be released if no longer deemed a risk to the public, even if they refuse to disclose information. But the parole board will legally be required to consider whether they have cooperated with inquiries as part of their assessment. Justice Secretary and Law Chancellor, the Right Honorable Robert Buckland, QCMP, said, "Denying families a chance to lay their loved ones to rest is a cruelty beyond words, compounding their grief further. Helen's Law makes it absolutely clear that murderers and evil sexual offenders who refuse to disclose information about their victims should expect to face longer behind bars." Thanks to the tireless effort of Marie McCourtin and the campaigners, more families should get the answers and closure they deserve. In 2021, Campbell's brother Alex Sharkey published a book entitled My Brother the Killer, detailing his life with his brother and the events after Danielle's disappearance. On 20th anniversary of Danielle's disappearance, Essex police held an event to remember her. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.